Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we are going to talk about one of the most powerful and maybe one of the sneakiest forces that shapes how we think. It's called confirmation bias. And really, it's that little echo in our heads that just loves to hear what it already believes.
So, let me ask you this. You ever buy a new car, let's say it's a blue SUV, and then all of a sudden you see blue SUVs everywhere you look? I mean, did the number of blue SUVs on the road just magically triple overnight? Or did your brain just get a new filter? Well, that little phenomenon, that gets us right to the heart of what we're going to unpack today.
So, let's put an official name on this thing. In this first part, we're going to get the clear what is it definition of confirmation bias.
Okay, there it is, the textbook definition. It's our brain's tendency to look for, to focus on, and to remember information that just so happens to confirm what we already think. You can think of it like a mental shortcut. It's our brain trying to make sense of a really complex world by finding patterns it already expects to see and, kind of sweeping the stuff that doesn't fit under the rug. But, okay, how do we really know this is a thing? I mean, how can you actually measure a bias like this? Well, we can see it in action in a really brilliant classic psychology experiment that shows just how badly we're all wired to look for a yes answer.
So, this is called the Wasson selection task. It goes way back to the 1960s. So here's the deal. People were given a very simple rule to test. The rule is, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it must have an even number on the other. Simple enough, right? Their only job was to figure out which cards they needed to flip to see if the rule holds true. All right, now it's your turn. Imagine these 4 cards are sitting on a table in front of you. You see an A, a B, a 4, and a 7. To be absolutely sure about this rule, which 2 cards do you have to flip over? Go ahead, take a second and think about it. What's your gut instinct?
Okay, so if you said A and 4, you are in very good company. That is what almost everybody picks. And it makes perfect sense, right? You flip the A to see if there's an even number, and you flip the 4 to see if there's a vowel. But this is the trap. This is our confirmation bias in action. You're only looking for evidence that the rule is true. The right answer is actually A and 7. Now, flipping the A is a no-brainer. You've got to check for that even number. But the real test, the one that most people missed, is the 7. Why? Well, think about it. If you flip over that 7 and you find a vowel on the other side, boom! You have just instantly shattered the rule. You found a vowel with an odd number. Flipping the 4 doesn't really tell you anything useful, because the rule never said an even number has to have a vowel. This is the key to really good thinking. You don't just try to prove yourself right. You have to actively try to prove yourself wrong. So this is way more than just a clever little card game. This exact same mental glitch shapes huge, high-stakes decisions out in the real world. And most of the time, we don't even have a clue it's happening. So take a look at this study with a girl named Hannah. Researchers had 2 groups of people watch the very same video of Hannah taking a test. And her performance was deliberately mixed. She got some tough questions right, but she also missed some easy ones. Now, here's the twist. The only difference between the 2 groups was the backstory they were told. One group heard Hannah was from a wealthy, high-achieving background. The other group heard she was from a poorer, low-achieving one. And the results? They're pretty staggering. The group that thought Hannah was wealthy, they rated her performance as above grade level. They remembered the hard questions she nailed. But the group that thought she was poor, they watched the exact same video and rated her as below grade level. They focused on the easy questions she missed. Their expectations completely changed what they saw.
And this kind of thing is everywhere. Think about a doctor who makes a quick diagnosis. They might unconsciously pay less attention to lab results that don't fit that first idea. Or in a courtroom, a juror who gets a bad first impression of a defendant is more likely to remember the evidence that proves them right. And yeah, in politics, governments can fall into the trap of only paying attention to the data that supports a policy they already want to pass.
Okay, so the story seems pretty simple so far, right? We get an idea in our head, and then we look for things that prove it. But what if I told you that's not the whole story? Recent research has thrown a really surprising curveball into how we think about this. So in psychology, there are these 2 big ideas that are kind of opposites. There's the primacy effect, which basically says the first thing you hear is the most powerful. But then there's the recency effect, which says the last thing you hear is what really sticks. For the longest time, the common wisdom was that confirmation bias is what drives that primacy effect. Your first impression sets the tone, and everything that comes after is seen through that lens. But what if it's more complicated than that? And this is where it gets really, really interesting. A modern mathematical model actually shows something that sounds totally backwards. It found that confirmation bias can actually cause a recency effect. Under certain conditions, the last thing you hear can be the most persuasive. The model shows that if your first belief isn't super strong, a conflicting opinion can kind of soften it up, making you even more open to the next thing you hear. It totally flips the old way of thinking on its head. And that same model doesn't just stop there. It also helps us understand some of the most extreme and honestly, the weirdest ways our brains protect our beliefs.
First up, cognitive dissonance. You know that really uncomfortable, squirmy feeling you get when you're trying to believe two things that totally contradict each other? Well, this model gives us a picture of what's happening. When you hear a conflicting idea from someone you respect, your belief might not just shift, it can actually split in two. You can end up holding both your old belief and the new, contradictory one at the same time.
And then, things get even stranger with something called the boomerang effect. This is what happens when someone you see as having zero credibility tries to persuade you of something. Instead of moving even a little bit toward their opinion, your own opinion actually slingshots even further away from them. Their attempt to persuade you literally backfires and makes you believe your own thing even harder.
And this explains so much of what we see in the real world, right? Especially in politics. When voters who are really passionate about a candidate hear criticism from a news source they already distrust, it doesn't make them question their candidate. Nope, it often makes them double down, and their support actually gets stronger.
So after all this, from card tricks to political battles, what are we supposed to do? How do we navigate this crazy echo chamber that's built right into our own heads?
So let's just boil it down. The big takeaway here is that confirmation bias isn't just you being stubborn. It's a really deep, complex process. It shapes our reality in ways we don't expect. It can twist our logic, and surprisingly, it can make the last thing we hear the most important. And in those extreme cases, it can make us reject facts entirely, or somehow believe two opposite things at once.
And that brings us to the end. So I want to leave you with one last question, and it goes all the way back to that card game at the beginning. What is one belief that you hold, something you feel is absolutely true, that you have never once actively tried to prove wrong? Thinking about that, well, that might just tell you where the echo in your own head is the loudest. Thanks for joining me.